The moment Susanna Rhodes stepped off the stagecoach in Dellwood, Texas, with nothing but a worn carpet bag, $3 silver, and the particular kind of desperation that comes from having absolutely nowhere else to go, she decided that whatever this dusty, sun-scorched town had to offer, she would take it and be grateful. It was the spring of 1878, and Dellwood was the sort of place that the railroad had not quite reached yet, which meant it was still raw and honest in the way that only truly untamed places can be. The main street was packed dirt-baked hard by the Texas sun, lined with a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Silver Spur, a small church with a crooked cross on top, and a handful of other establishments that catered to the needs of ranchers, cowboys, and the occasional traveler passing through on their way to somewhere better. Red dust hung in the air like a permanent veil, and the smell of horses and leather and wood smoke was so thick you could almost taste it. Susanna was 24 years old and had the kind of face that people called handsome rather than pretty, because pretty suggested something delicate, and Susanna had never been delicate a day in her life. Her hair was the deep brown of good river mud, pulled back in a practical knot at the base of her neck, and her eyes were a clear, steady gray that had a way of looking at people as though she could see clean through whatever front they were putting on. She stood 5'6" in her boots, which were cracked at the heel and badly in need of new stitching, and she held herself very straight, the way a person does when they are trying not to let anyone see how tired they truly are. She had come from Dallas, where she had spent the last 2 years working as a seamstress in a dress shop owned by a widow named Mrs. Elspeth Crane. Mrs. Crane had been a decent enough employer, neither cruel nor particularly kind, until the previous December when Mrs. Crane's nephew had arrived from back east with a new wife who had opinions about the shop, and those opinions had included the elimination of Susanna's position. Susanna had spent January and February quietly searching for other work in Dallas, but Dallas in the winter of 1878 was not a city that was easy on women who had no family and no connections and no money to speak of. She had answered an advertisement in the Dellwood Gazette, which had reached Dallas through a series of trades and exchanges the way newspapers did in those days, seeking a seamstress and laundress for the Dellwood community. The advertisement had promised honest work and fair wages, and Susanna had written a letter and received a reply from a Mrs. Harold Pettifer, who ran the local boarding house and served as something of an informal employment agent for the town, and now here she was. She looked up and down the main street of Dellwood and took a long, slow breath. "All right," she said quietly to herself, "this will do." She was wrong about that, as it turned out, but not in the way she expected. Mrs. Pettifer was a small, round woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair and the brisk, no-nonsense manner of someone who had managed difficult situations for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be surprised by anything. She met Susanna at the boarding house, which was a 2-story wooden building on the east end of Main Street, and showed her to a room on the second floor that was clean and small, and had a window that looked out over the back garden where someone had planted a brave little patch of sunflowers. "The seamstress work is real," Mrs. Pettifer said, setting a key on the dresser. "Mrs. Alderman over at the general store has been handling alterations and such herself, but she is getting on in years and her eyes are not what they were. You will split your time between the store and here, because I also need help with the washing and mending for the boarders. The pay is room, board, and $2 a week. It is not generous, but it is steady." "That suits me fine," Susanna said. Mrs. Pettifer looked at her with the assessing gaze of a woman who had seen a great many people come through her door. "You have experience, real experience, not the kind people invent on the spot." "7 years," Susanna said. "I learned from my mother who learned from hers. I can do plain sewing, fancy work, tailoring for men's garments, and I have some experience with saddle repair, though it has been a few years since I practiced that last." Mrs. Pettifer's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. Well then, you will start tomorrow morning. Tonight you rest. Dinner is at 6 and I do not hold it for late arrivals. Susanna settled into Dellwood with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of a woman who understood that the only way to build a life from scratch was to take it one small piece at a time. Within a week, she had established herself with Mrs. Alderman at the general store, whose name was Ruth and who was indeed struggling with her failing eyesight, and who was so relieved to have competent help that she sometimes patted Susanna's hand and called her a godsend. Within 2 weeks, Susanna knew most of the regular customers by name and had already taken in alterations for half a dozen families who had been waiting months for someone with skill enough to tackle the work properly. She liked Dellwood, she found. She liked its straightforwardness. People here said what they meant and meant what they said, and there was a kind of honesty in the daily grind of it, the work and the weather and the endless business of survival, that she found more comfortable than the social complexities of a bigger city. She made quiet friends with Ruth Alderman and with a young woman named Clara Briggs who was married to the blacksmith and was expecting her first child, and had a laugh like a dinner bell and an opinion on absolutely everything. It was Clara who first mentioned Ira Crawford. They were sitting in the back room of the general store on a Thursday afternoon in early April, Clara ostensibly helping Susanna organize a pile of fabric bolts that had come in on the last supply wagon, actually mostly watching Susanna work and talking about the people of Dellwood with the cheerful relentlessness of someone who has been starved for good conversation. "You know what you ought to do," Clara said, pulling at a loose thread on her apron, "is come to the social on Saturday. The church holds one every month and it is the best chance to meet people properly. Everybody comes." "I was not planning to," Susanna said, cutting a length of navy blue cotton with her shears. "Of course you were not planning to because you do not plan to do anything that is not directly related to work," Clara said, with the frankness that Susanna had already come to appreciate about her. "But you should. You have been here 3 weeks and the only people you speak to are Ruth and me and Mrs. Pettifer, and Mrs. Pettifer does not exactly count as company." Susanna smiled at that. "She is very efficient company." "She is a wall with opinions," Clara said. "Come to the social. There will be dancing and someone will have made that peach pie that Brother Carver's wife does, and it is absolutely worth attending for that alone." She paused. "And there are some very fine-looking cowboys in this county." "I am not interested in cowboys," Susanna said, without looking up from her work. "You say that," Clara said, with the knowing smile of a woman deeply satisfied with the state of her own marriage, "and then you meet one." She did not, as it happened, meet Ira Crawford at the church social. She met him 4 days before it, on a Tuesday morning, in a situation that could charitably be described as awkward. She was crossing the main street, with a bundle of finished mending for Mrs. Pettifer, her arms full of neatly folded shirts and trousers, when a riderless horse came around the corner of the livery stable at a full run, spooked by something, and Susanna had approximately 3 seconds to make a decision. She stepped back sharply, her heel caught in the gap between 2 boards in the raised wooden sidewalk, and she went down hard, the bundle scattering across the dirt of the street, and a strong hand caught her by the arm before she could hit the ground properly. She looked up and found herself looking at a man who was, she noted with the slightly irritated objectivity of someone who has just been very nearly trampled, extremely tall. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean but broad in the shoulder, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw that had seen a razor recently, but not this morning. His eyes were a particular shade of brown that reminded her of good amber, clear and warm, and there were lines at the corners of them that suggested he spent a great deal of time squinting into the sun or laughing, or possibly both. He was wearing clothes that had seen considerable use, a faded blue shirt with the cuffs rolled back, worn dungaree trousers, boots that were serviceable if not fancy, and a hat that had been good once and still functioned as a hat even if it no longer aspired to elegance. "You all right?" he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking calmly in situations that were not calm. "Yes," Susanna said, which was true if slightly optimistic, since her ankle was protesting loudly. She pulled herself upright with as much dignity as she could manage and looked at her scattered mending spread across the dirt. "My washing." He was already moving to gather it, crouching down and picking up shirts and trousers with quick, careful hands, shaking the dust off them as best he could before handing them back to her. "The Harker boy's horse," he said, nodding in the direction the animal had gone. "Spooked at a feed sack. He is going to hear about that." "It is not the horse's fault," Susanna said, because it was true. He looked at her with a slight startled expression as though he had not expected that response, and then something in his face settled into something warmer. "No," he agreed. "Reckon it is not." He handed her the last of the mending and she took it, rearranging the bundle. Her ankle ached. She did not mention it. "Ira Crawford," he said, touching the brim of his hat in the manner of a man who had been properly raised. "I have a small place out east of town past the creek." "Susanna Rhodes," she said. "I am the new seamstress. I am working for Mrs. Alderman and Mrs. Pettifer." "I know," he said. "This is a small town." "I have noticed," she said. There was a pause between them, but it was not an uncomfortable one. It was the kind of pause that happens when two people are taking a measurement of each other and finding the measurement interesting. "Your ankle," he said. "Is fine," she said. He looked at her with those amber eyes in a way that suggested he did not entirely believe her. "There is a bench outside the store." She was going to refuse, because she had things to deliver, and she was not in the habit of accepting assistance from strangers who had no claim on her attention. But her ankle chose that precise moment to send a sharp reminder of its grievances up through her leg, and she said, "For a moment," instead. He walked with her to the bench outside the general store and stood nearby while she sat and put the bundle down beside her, and the street went on about its business around them. A couple of ranch hands riding through, a woman with a basket heading for the post office, the normal Tuesday morning of a small Texas town in 1878. "Have you been in Dellwood long?" Susanna asked, because sitting in silence felt stranger than speaking. "Born here," he said, "or close enough to it. My father came out when I was 3. He is gone now. I stayed." "Why?" she asked, which was more direct than she had intended, but Ira Crawford did not seem bothered by it. "Because it is home," he said simply, "and because the land is good, or it can be with work." "And you work your land alone?" "I have a man who helps me part of the year," he said. "Fellow named Pete Garza." "Good man. He winters with his family in San Antonio and comes back in spring." He paused. "It is just a small operation, nothing grand." She nodded. Her ankle was easing. She tested it carefully against the ground. "I should get this delivered," she said, standing. It held. "Good." "Of course," he said, and stepped back to give her room. He touched his hat again. "Miss Rhodes." "Mr. Crawford," she said, and picked up her bundle and walked away, and did not look back, though she was very aware of the particular quality of the silence behind her that suggested he was watching her go. Clara Briggs was absolutely insufferable about it when Susanna mentioned the encounter at dinner that evening. "Ira Crawford," Clara said, her eyes lighting up in a way that made Susanna instantly regret having spoken. "Oh, Susanna, he is one of the best men in this county. He is quiet and he is honest and he is steady, which in this part of Texas is worth more than most things. And he is not married and he has never been married, and every woman between here and Abilene has at some point entertained hopes, and he has been polite to all of them and interested in none of them." "I am not entertaining hopes," Susanna said. "He picked up my laundry off the street. It was a neighborly gesture." "He sat with you," Clara said. "I was resting my ankle." "He could have just tipped his hat and walked on." Susanna looked at her plate. "Pass the bread," she said. Clara passed the bread with the expression of a woman who had made her point and was content to wait. Ira Crawford came into the general store on Thursday morning to buy a box of nails, a length of rope, and a sack of flour, and he said good morning to Ruth Alderman, and then noticed Susanna at the back counter, where she was working on a pair of trousers that needed their seat reinforced. and he said good morning to her too, and she said good morning back. And Ruth Alderman, who was 63 years old and had seen every flavor of human attraction there was, very carefully studied the shelf of dry goods in front of her and smiled at it. He came in again on Saturday morning for lamp oil, and this time Susanna was the one at the front counter, and they exchanged a handful of sentences about the weather and the road conditions east of the creek, and whether the supply wagon was expected before the end of the month. And by the time he paid for his lamp oil and touched his hat and left, Susanna was aware that she had been paying considerably more attention than the conversation strictly warranted. She went to the church social that evening, which she had decided on before Thursday's encounter, and which had nothing to do with the fact that Clara had mentioned cowboys would be present. The social was held in the church hall, which was really just the church with the pews pushed back against the walls, and someone had strung paper lanterns from the rafters that glowed warm and orange in the dusk, and there was indeed peach pie from Mrs. Carver, and a man with a fiddle and a man with a concertina playing reels and waltzes with more enthusiasm than precision. The hall was warm with bodies and conversation, and Susanna stood with Clara and her husband Tom Briggs, who was a big, quiet man with enormous hands and the gentle manner of someone who knew their own strength, and she drank lemonade and watched the dancing and let herself, for the first time in a considerable while, enjoy an evening. Ira Crawford arrived late, as she learned was his habit, slipping in through the side door with his hat in his hands and nodding to people he knew, which appeared to be everyone. He had made some effort with his appearance, she noted. His shirt was clean and his hair had been combed. He looked around the room in the measured, unhurried way of a man taking stock, and his gaze found her across the crowd, and he did something that she would not have predicted. He smiled. Not a polite, social smile. A real one that started slow and changed the whole quality of his face. She looked away first, which she immediately recognized as a mistake, because Clara had been watching, and Clara made a small, triumphant sound into her lemonade that Susanna chose to ignore. He worked his way around the edge of the room with no particular hurry, stopping to speak to several people, and eventually came to stand near the group where Susanna was standing, and greeted Tom Briggs with the warmth of an old friendship and Clara with a genuine fondness that told her they had known each other long, and then he looked at Susanna and said, "Good evening, Miss Rhodes," in that quiet, even voice. "Good evening, Mr. Crawford," she said. "I am glad you came," he said. "Clara has been known to be very persuasive." "I heard that," Clara said serenely. "You were meant to," he said, and then he looked at the dancing and then back at Susanna with the careful expression of a man who is aware that he is taking a risk. "I wonder if you might care to dance. I should warn you that I am only middling at it." "I am not much better," Susanna said honestly. "Then we will be equally embarrassed," he said. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came out more freely than she had intended, and she saw his expression register it the way a man registers something he was not prepared for and finds he likes very much. "All right," she said. "One dance." They danced too, both reels, neither of them with any particular grace, both of them laughing more than the dances strictly required, and when the second reel ended and they stood slightly out of breath at the edge of the floor, Susanna thought that she had not felt this comfortable with another person in a very long time. They walked afterward, out through the side door into the cool April night, because the hall had grown very warm and neither of them had proposed it exactly. It had simply happened the way some things do, both moving in the same direction at the same time, and they stood outside in the dark where the stars were extraordinary, the way stars are in places that have not yet been drowned in lamplight, and they talked. They talked about things that mattered and things that did not. She told him about Dallas and Mrs. Crane and the nephew's opinionated wife, and he told her about the land east of the creek and what it took to keep a small cattle operation running through a hard Texas summer. And she asked him questions about the land and the cattle, and he answered them seriously, without the condescension that some men could not help bringing to conversations about practical matters with women. and she found that she liked him with a steadiness that felt different from attraction, older and more reliable. Though the attraction was also there and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. "Can I ask you something direct?" she said at one point. "I generally prefer it," he said. "Clara says you have never been interested in settling down," she said. She did not say it critically, she said it as a fact. "I am wondering if it is true, and if so, why?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasively quiet, thoughtfully quiet. "It is true that I have not found the right person," he said finally. "And I think I have been careful about it, maybe more careful than is strictly practical, because when my father died he left my mother with 4 children and a failing homestead, and she spent the rest of her life working herself to pieces holding it together. She was a good woman, and she deserved better than what she got." He paused. "I do not want to make promises I cannot keep. And I do not want to be chosen for the wrong reasons." Susanna looked at him. The starlight was kind to his face, softening the weathered lines of it. "What would you consider the wrong reasons?" "Money," he said. "Property, security." He looked out at the dark. "There are men in this county with far more than I have, men who own large spreads and carry real wealth. I am not that. I am a man with a small place and modest enough means and a lot of work ahead of me. I think it matters to know that someone is choosing you, and not the version of you they imagine you might become." It was the most she had heard him say at once, and she had the sense it was more than he generally offered, and she treated it with the care it deserved. "That is a reasonable fear," she said. "Is it?" He looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Being wanted for the wrong reasons is a particular kind of loneliness. I understand it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze because she was not the sort of woman who looked away from important things. "Miss Rhodes," he said, "I think you might be the most straightforward person I have met in some years." "I have found it saves time," she said. He smiled again, that slow, real smile. "Good night," he said after a moment. "I hope you will come to the next social." "I might," she said. "Good night, Mr. Crawford." She went back inside and found Clara watching the door with undisguised expectation, and Susanna sat down beside her and said nothing for a moment and then said, "He is a good man," in a tone that was meant to be neutral and was not. "I know," Clara said and patted her hand. What happened over the following weeks was not the sudden, lightning-strike variety of falling in love that was popular in the dime novels that circulated through Dellwood's small community, passed from hand to hand until the covers fell off. It was slower and more interesting than that. It was the kind of falling in love that builds itself from small, accumulated moments, each one individually unremarkable and collectively irreversible. Ira Crawford came into the general store more often than strictly necessary. He did not pretend otherwise, and Susanna did not pretend not to notice. He lingered at the counter when the store was not busy, asking her opinion on things he did not actually need her opinion on, and she gave it freely because she was not the sort of woman who withheld herself to create intrigue, and they fell into a rhythm of conversation that felt, to her, like something she had been missing for a very long time without quite knowing what it was. He was direct, as she was. He did not say charming things unless he meant them, and he meant them more often than she would have expected. He told her that he thought she was one of the most capable people he had encountered, which was high praise coming from a man for whom capability was perhaps the primary virtue, and he told her that he liked the way she looked at problems, not as obstacles, but as things with solutions that simply had not been located yet. She told him about her mother, who had died of a fever when Susanna was 17, and about her father, who had been a kind and well-intentioned man utterly unsuited to the practical demands of life, who had died 2 years later of a broken heart dressed up as pneumonia. She had been on her own since 19, making her way through the machinery of a world that had not especially been designed with her in mind, and she had done it without bitterness, because bitterness was a luxury she could not afford, though she was honest enough to admit that it had sometimes been close. He listened to all of this with the complete attention of a man who genuinely wanted to understand, not simply to wait for his turn to speak. And she found that this quality in him was rarer than it ought to be, and more affecting than she was entirely prepared for. He asked if he could escort her to the next church social, formally this time, which meant he was asking something rather larger than whether they would stand together in the church hall. She said yes without deliberating over it, which told her something about herself. He came to call for her at Mrs. Pettifer's boarding house with his hat properly cleaned and his good shirt, which was somewhat less worn than the blue one he favored for every day. And Mrs. Pettifer opened the door and looked at him with an expression of supreme knowingness, and fetched Susanna with a decorum that did not quite conceal her satisfaction. They walked to the church hall together and danced, and this time they were somewhat better at it, having each apparently practiced privately in the intervening weeks, which neither of them admitted to the other though both suspected. He brought her a cup of lemonade and stood beside her while she drank it, and she was aware of the warmth of him, the solid, particular presence of him, in a way that went considerably past neighborly. On the walk home he took her hand. He did not ask first, but it was not an assumption of the presumptuous kind. It was tentative, and when she did not pull away he laced his fingers through hers with a gentleness that made something catch in her chest. "I think," he said, after they had walked in comfortable silence for half a block, "that I would like to court you properly if you are willing." "I believe that is more or less what we have been doing," she said. "I know," he said. "I am asking for it to be official." She turned to look at him. His face in the lamplight of the main street was serious and a little careful, and she understood what he was risking in asking, the same thing she would be risking in answering, which was the particular vulnerability of wanting something you might not get. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He squeezed her hand. They walked the rest of the way to Mrs. Pettifer's in a silence that was full of things, and he said good night at the door and waited until she was inside before he left, which was the proper thing to do and which she noticed. The courtship was, by the standards of Dellwood in 1878, a serious one. He called on her twice a week when his work allowed, and they walked together in the evenings in the long Texas twilight, and he sometimes brought her things from his place, early wildflowers from the creek bank, once a handful of pecans from the tree at the edge of his property, things of no particular monetary value, but offered with a care that made them worth more than they were. They went to church together on Sundays and sat in the pew behind the Briggs family, and Clara turned around every Sunday to smile at them with a satisfaction that bordered on parental. He took her out to see his land one Sunday afternoon in May, driving her in his wagon along the rutted track east of town, and over the creek crossing where the water ran clear over smooth limestone, and showing her the property with the honest pride of a man who knew the value of what he had built without pretending it was more than it was. And it was, she thought, modest. The house was small, 2 rooms with a lean-to kitchen added on the back, the wood weathered to silver gray, the porch straight and sturdy but unadorned. There was a barn in better condition than the house, which told her about his priorities, and a corral with 6 horses and a small holding pen for cattle, and beyond that the land rolled out in the particular way of eastern Texas, grass and scrub oak and the occasional cedar, lovely in an understate way that required a certain willingness to look for it. "It needs work," he said, with a matter-of-fact quality that was not apologetic. "The house in particular. The kitchen roof wants replacing before the rainy season." "It is good land," she said. "I can see that." He looked at her and she thought she saw something in his face that was measuring something she did not quite understand yet, some calculation she was not privy to. "It is," he said. "It will be better in another 5 years with steady work." "Most things are better with steady work," she said. He smiled, slow and warm. "Yes," he said, "they are." She did not know then what he was testing. She was only looking at the land and thinking that it was honest and real, and that there was something in that honesty that she liked, the same thing she liked about him. She had no way of knowing that he was watching her look at it and reading things in her expression that she would not have thought to conceal, because she had no idea there was anything to conceal or be read. He was watching for something specific. The truth of it was this, and it was something she would not learn for several months yet. Ira Crawford was not a man of modest means. He was not precisely wealthy in the Eastern sense of the word, but by the standards of Dellwood, Texas, in 1878, he was a man of considerable property. His father, in the way of men who are no good with people but excellent with money, had quietly accumulated land over 2 decades, buying parcels as they became available at the low prices that were available to a man who was patient and had cash. When he had died 6 years ago, he had left Ira not only the 2-room house and the land that surrounded it, but deeds to 4 additional parcels totaling nearly 800 acres, some of it leased to neighboring ranchers for grazing, and a substantial amount of money in the Dellwood Bank, the existence of which was known only to Ira, his lawyer in Abilene, and the bank president, a man named Gerald Flowers who kept other people's business as carefully as he kept his own money. None of this was visible in Ira's daily life. He had always lived simply, which was a preference and not a necessity, and he dressed in working clothes because he worked, and he drove the old wagon because the wagon functioned, and he bought nails and rope and flour at the general store, and paid for them without ostentation, because spending money to signal wealth had always struck him as a particular kind of vulgarity. He had watched men in this county pursue women with their wallets, and he had watched those same men be chosen by women who wanted the wallet and not its owner. And he had decided, somewhere in his 30s, and after one specific incident involving a woman from Austin who had been very charming until she had met Gerald Flowers at a bank function, and learned what Gerald knew, that he needed to know something certain before he gave his heart over to another person. He needed to know she would stay if there was nothing to stay for except him. It was not a sophisticated plan. He would have been the first to admit that. But it was an honest one, rooted in a fear that was genuine and hard-earned. And when Susanna Rhodes had come to Dellwood with her cracked boots and her clear gray eyes and her complete lack of interest in anyone's bank balance, he had found himself watching her with something that went past simple attraction. He had taken her to see the property and watched her look at it, and say it was good land, not good enough or more than she had expected or anything that suggested she was calculating the worth of it. She had looked at it the way you look at something you are just seeing, plainly and without agenda. He had gone home that evening and sat on his porch in the dark and thought about it for a long time. He called on her the following Tuesday and they walked along the creek in the late afternoon light, the water running bright over the stones, the cottonwoods along the bank new with their spring leaves, and he told her more about the daily realities of his operation, the work of it, the expense of feed and veterinary care and fence repair, the way a dry year could set a small rancher back 2 seasons in one, and she listened and asked practical questions. And he watched her face and found nothing in it that was calculating the sums. "Is it sustainable?" she asked. "On its own, I mean." "Without a particularly good year." "It is," he said. "It is not much, but it is not precarious." "That matters more than people give it credit for," she said. "I have seen what it does to a family when the money is uncertain. My father was never able to secure anything steady. It was not for lack of trying, but it made everything else uncertain too." She was quiet for a moment. "I would rather have a modest life that holds than a grand one that does not." He looked at the creek. "That is exactly what I have," he said. "Then I think you have done well," she said simply. He nearly told her then. He came very close. The words were there, assembled and ready, and he held them back because the fear was also still there, the particular fear of a man who has been looked at for the wrong reasons before and who needed to be certain. He told himself he would wait a little longer. He told himself it was responsible caution and not cowardice. He was not entirely right about that, but he was not entirely wrong either. The weeks became a month, and the month stretched toward summer, and the courtship deepened in the way of things that are real, with the easy intimacy of two people who have become necessary to each other's daily life. He walked with her in the evenings and sat with her on Mrs. Pettifer's porch on Sunday afternoons, and she had started bringing needlework to do while they talked, because her hands were used to working and idleness felt strange to her, and he liked watching her hands, the quick, certain way they moved through the fabric, the same quality of confidence and precision he had noticed in everything she did. He helped her when the Alderman store roof developed a leak after a late May storm, climbing up there himself on a Saturday morning, while she and Ruth organized the store below to protect the fabric bolts from dripping water. He spent 4 hours up there with shingles and a hammer, and came down with his shirt wet through with sweat and a long scrape along his forearm from an exposed nail, and she cleaned the scrape at the counter with the iodine from Ruth's medicine cabinet with a focused care that he felt in his chest rather than his arm. "You did not have to do that," she said, pressing a clean cloth to the scrape. "The roof needed fixing," he said. "You could have told her to hire someone." "This was faster," he said. "And I was here." She looked up at him from under her lashes, which was an entirely unintentional gesture that did nevertheless have an effect. "Thank you," she said, "just that." But with a quality to it that made it mean more than the words. In early June, Pete Garza arrived from San Antonio, a compact, serious-faced man of about 40 who shook Susanna's hand when Ira introduced them, and looked at her with the considering expression of someone who had known Ira for a long time, and was taking the measure of whoever he had chosen to care about. He approved of her, she sensed, in a straightforward way that had nothing to do with social performance and everything to do with the simple observation that she was capable and real. Pete told her, when Ira was briefly occupied with the horses, that Ira Crawford was the most stubborn man he had ever worked for and the most fair. He said it as though these two qualities were inextricably linked, and she thought they probably were. Trouble came in the middle of June, as it will. There was a man named Horace Biggs who had a large ranch operation north of Dellwood, 800 acres of his own, and the kind of money that had come to some men in Texas in the years after the war through means that did not bear particularly close examination. He was 52 years old and had been widowed 2 years earlier, and had decided, in the way of men who are accustomed to acquisition, that he wanted a new wife. He had noticed Susanna Rhodes within weeks of her arrival in Dellwood, and had said nothing, waiting with the patience of a man who expected that most things would eventually come to him if he gave them time. When it became clear to him that Susanna was being courted by Ira Crawford, and appeared to be responding with what looked very much like genuine feeling, Horace Biggs decided to become interested. He called at the general store on a Wednesday morning when Ira was out at his property, and Ruth Alderman was in the back dealing with a delivery, and he stood at the counter with the particular brand of casual confidence that comes from owning a great deal of land, and said good morning to Susanna with a warmth that was performance rather than feeling. He was handsome in a polished way, well dressed, with silver at his temples and the manner of a man who was certain of his welcome. He bought nothing particular and stayed longer than any purchase required, asking her questions about herself, her history, her plans, the sort of personal questions that are intrusive when asked by someone who does not have the right to ask them. She answered briefly and moved on with her work in the way of a woman who is making a point. "I understand you have been spending time with Ira Crawford," Horace Biggs said, finally arriving at what he had come to say. "That is correct," Susanna said. "He is a decent enough man," Biggs said, with the generosity of someone bestowing charity. "Hard-working, but he is not a man of means. He has a small place and a modest operation. I would not want you to have formed an attachment without understanding that." Susanna put down her shears and looked at him directly. "Mr. Biggs," she said, "I am going to say this very clearly so that there is no confusion. Ira Crawford's finances are not your business, and they are not a consideration in my feelings for him. and the nature of my attachment to him is certainly not something I would be discussing with you. Was there something you needed from the store today?" His expression tightened with the particular irritation of a man who is not accustomed to being handled. "I am simply suggesting," he said, "that you consider your options carefully." "I have done so," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Biggs." He left, and Ruth Alderman emerged from the back with a pile of fabric samples and looked at Susanna with admiration barely contained. "I heard all of that," she said. "Good," Susanna said, and picked up her shears again. She told Ira about it that evening on their walk because she believed in telling people things that were relevant, and she watched his face go through a sequence of feelings, concern and something that might have been anger, though it was the contained kind, and then something else that she could not quite name. "He will try again," Ira said. "He will not succeed," she said equally. He looked at her with that amber gaze. "No," he said. "I do not think he will." But what struck him, walking beside her in the long June evening light, was not the threat of Horace Biggs. It was what she had said, that Ira Crawford's finances were not a consideration in her feelings for him. He turned it over in his mind with the careful attention he gave to everything that mattered, and it sat in him like something settling, like stones finding their place in a wall. He was close to telling her. He knew he was close. The fear was still present, but it had changed its quality, become something smaller and less insistent, because he had been watching her for 2 months and she had shown him, in 100 different small ways, who she was and what she valued, and none of it had anything to do with what he had in the bank. He told himself he would tell her soon. Then, on a Thursday in late June, something happened that accelerated his decision in a way he had not foreseen. He had been in Abilene for 3 days on necessary business with his lawyer, a man named Alexander Trent, reviewing the terms of a lease agreement on one of the northern parcels and dealing with a boundary question that had been festering since the previous autumn. While he was there, he had run into Gerald Flowers, the bank president, who was in Abilene for a bankers' meeting and who had with him, at dinner that evening, a man named Chester Wald, who was a land speculator from Fort Worth and who had a great many opinions about Texas real estate and a great deal of interest in acquiring it. Chester Wald had heard of Dellwood. He had heard there were properties east of the creek worth looking at. He had names. Ira's name was one of them. He came home to Dellwood on Friday afternoon to find, from Clara Briggs, that Chester Wald had arrived in town that morning, had taken a room at Mrs. Pettifer's boarding house, and had already introduced himself to Susanna at the general store, and had been, by all accounts, very forthcoming about his purpose in Dellwood and the names of the property owners he was interested in speaking to. Susanna's name was not one of those property owners, but Ira's was. Found her at the store closing up for the day, and she looked at him with a careful expression that he recognized as the look she wore when she was organizing information. "You had a visitor of sorts today," she said. "A Mr. Chester Wald." "I know," he said. "I heard. He mentioned your property," she said. "He mentioned it in the context of being quite valuable for someone wanting to acquire land along the creek. He mentioned several parcels." She paused. "He mentioned 800 acres. The silence that followed was not comfortable. "He did," Ira said. She looked at him with those clear gray eyes that did not flinch. "Ira," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr., and it hit him somewhere below the sternum. "How much land do you actually own?" He had come to the moment. He recognized it the way you recognize a door you have been walking toward for a long time. "Come sit with me," he said. They sat on the bench outside the store in the late afternoon light that was going gold and long, and he told her. He told her about his father's acquisitions, and the parcels and the bank account, and the lease agreements, and all the quiet, unspectacular accumulation of a man who had been careful with money for 30 years. He told her that the 2-room house was real, that the modest daily life was real, that those were his genuine preferences and not a performance. He told her that what had not been real was the impression he had allowed her to have of his circumstances, and he told her why. He told her about the woman from Austin and the way he had felt when he understood that she had been calculating all along. He told her about watching his mother work herself to pieces for a man who had not provided well enough. He told her that he had been afraid, and that the fear had led him to something that he would not call a lie exactly, though he understood if she did. He told her all of it, plainly and without softening it more than honesty permitted. When he finished, she sat very still for a long moment, looking at the main street of Dellwood in the evening light. Her hands were folded in her lap and her face was composed in the way of a person who is thinking seriously. He waited. He had said everything there was to say, and now it was hers to hold. "You were testing me," she said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. He did not qualify it because it deserved to stand alone. She looked at him. "That is not a kind thing to do to a person," she said. "No," he said, "it is not. I know it." She was quiet again. "Did I pass?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that was almost wry but was also real and a little raw. "There was never a test to fail," he said. "There was only something I needed to understand. And I do. I did, I think, before Chester Wald arrived, but his arrival made it clear that I had waited too long to say it." She looked at the street again. A rider went past, and a dog trotted purposefully across in the other direction, and the world went on being entirely ordinary around this conversation that was not. "I am not angry about the money," she said. "I want you to understand that specifically. Whether you have 8 acres or 800 makes no difference to me in terms of how I feel about you, and I think you know that by now. If you do not, then you were not paying close attention." "I was paying very close attention," he said. "Then you know." She looked at him directly. "What I am is angry about the test, because it means that for 2 months you were watching me and measuring me, and I was not afforded the same understanding of what was actually happening. I was honest with you from the beginning, and you were not fully honest with me." "That is true," he said, "and I am sorry for it. Not because I regret understanding what I understand, but because you deserved better than to be managed." She held his gaze for a long time, and he held hers, and he did not look away because whatever she decided, she deserved to see his face clearly when she made the decision. "I would have stayed," she said, "if this were actually what you had shown me. The small house and the modest cattle operation and the work and the honest life. I would have stayed and been glad of it. I want you to know that. I want you to be certain of it." "I know it," he said. "I believe it." "Good," she said, "because it is true." She let out a breath. "And I am going to need some time to be properly irritated with you before I am finished being irritated, because I think I have earned that." Something in him eased so completely that he was almost light with it. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I will," she said. "An era. Yes. Do not do that again," she said. "Whatever comes next, I want it to be honest, both of us." "Yes," he said, "both of us." She stood up and smoothed her skirt and picked up the key to the store. "Good night," she said. "I will see you Sunday." "Good night, Susanna," he said. She went inside, and he sat on the bench for a moment in the evening air, and the relief was so complete that it felt like standing in rain after a very long dry spell. She gave herself, as she had indicated she would, about a week of being properly irritated, during which time she was perfectly civil to him at the store and on the Sunday church walk, and she did not pull away from him, but she was also not warm in the particular way she had been, and he respected it and did not press, because she had earned it, and because he was a man who understood that some things needed their time. On the following Saturday she came to find him at the livery stable, where he was picking up a harness that Bert Haas the liveryman had repaired for him, and she walked in out of the afternoon sunshine and said, "I have thought about it." "And?" he said, setting the harness down. "And you were afraid," she said. "I understand that. I do not think fear makes a person's behavior perfect, but I understand where it came from, and I understand that it was genuine, and that the outcome of it was, for all its imperfections, that you are now certain. And I am glad you are certain." She paused. "I would have preferred you to have found a different way to be certain. But I understand why you chose the one you did." "I could have asked you," he said. "Directly, I know that." You could have, she agreed, and I would have told you the truth, which is that I did not come to Dellwood looking for a wealthy man. I came looking for honest work and a place to build something. Those remain my ambitions. She looked at him steadily. What I also found here, which I did not expect and which I would not trade, is you. He crossed the space between them in 3 steps and took her hands in his, both of them, holding them carefully. Susanna, he said. I am not finished, she said, but she did not pull her hands away. All right, he said. I want to know that we are proceeding honestly from here. I want to know that if you have fears, you will tell me about them so that I can address them directly, and I will do the same for you. I'm not easy. I have opinions and I work hard, and I expect the same from the people around me. I'm not young enough to be unformed, and I'm not soft enough to pretend things do not matter when they do. If you want me, you want all of that. I want all of that, he said. Then all right, she said. He raised her hands and pressed his lips to the backs of them, first one and then the other, a gesture that was formal and tender all at once, and she felt it move through her like something settling. I love you, he said. He said it simply, the way he said most things without decoration, and that simplicity was what made it absolutely certain. She looked at his face for a long moment, at those amber eyes that had been watching her honestly even when the rest of the situation had not been entirely honest, and she said, I love you too. I have for some time. I was hoping you would catch up. He laughed. It was a good laugh, real and full, and she thought that she had not heard him laugh quite like that before, and that she intended to hear it as often as possible for as long as they were together. I believe I have, he said. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in late July, sitting on the bank of the creek on the land east of town, the water running clear over the limestone and the cottonwoods casting their moving shadows over the grass. He did not make a great occasion of it. He said simply that he could not imagine his life going forward without her in it, and would she do him the honor of being his wife? She said yes with a directness and completeness that left no room for doubt, and he put his arm around her, and she put her head against his shoulder, and they sat there by the creek for a long time in the easy quiet of 2 people who had found what they were looking for. Clara Briggs, upon being told, produced a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a shout and was entirely Clara, and then she hugged Susanna so hard that Susanna's carefully organized hair came loose. And then she turned to Ira and said, It took you long enough, and he said, You are probably right about that, and Clara said, I am always right about that, asked Tom, and Tom, who had witnessed the whole exchange, nodded with the patient expression of a man who has learned when the appropriate moment is to agree. They were married in September, in the Dellwood church with the crooked cross, on a Saturday morning when the Texas sky was a particular shade of blue that showed up in the fall and nowhere else, deep and clear and endless. Mrs. Pettifer sat in the second pew with an expression of controlled satisfaction, and Ruth Alderman wept happily through the whole ceremony, and Pete Garza stood at the back with his hat in his hands, and smiled with the quiet pleasure of a man who has watched something unfold from a distance and found it exactly right. Susanna wore a dress she had made herself, because of course she had, ivory cotton with small blue flowers worked along the collar and the cuffs in the embroidery stitch her mother had taught her, and she carried wildflowers from the creek bank because those were the ones she liked best. She walked herself down the aisle because there was no one to walk her, and she did it with her chin up and her gray eyes steady, and found Ira standing at the front of the church looking at her, with an expression of such unguarded feeling that she had to steady her own breathing before she reached him. They said their vows simply, as they did everything, without performance, meaning every word. When Brother Carver pronounced them husband and wife and Ira took her face in his hands and kissed her, the small congregation made a sound of collective warmth, and outside the church a horse tied at the post chose this precise moment to sneeze magnificently, and everyone laughed, and it was the perfect note on which to begin a marriage. The wedding supper was held in the church hall, the same hall where they had danced for the first time, and people brought food enough for twice as many guests, and there was music from the same fiddle and concertina that had played in April, and Susanna danced with her husband, who was still only middling at dancing, and she was still only marginally better, and neither of them cared in the least. They went home to the property east of the creek, which Ira had spent the summer making habitable in the ways that mattered, the kitchen roof replaced, the parlor wall replastered, a second bedroom added on the south side that was bright in the mornings, and Susanna stood on the porch in the September evening and looked at the land rolling away into the dark, and felt something in her chest that she recognized after a moment as the particular feeling of arrival. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed, coming to stand beside her. "I think," she said, "that I am going to like it here." "I hope so," he said, "since it is yours now too. All 800 acres." She said, and her voice had a light note in it. "All 800 acres," he confirmed. "And the 4 horses and the cattle and the barn and the 2 trees in the front yard and the creek." "The creek is lovely," she said. "I thought you would like it." She turned to look at him, this man she had married, this careful and honest and occasionally infuriating man who had watched her from behind a modest pretense until he was certain of her, and who was certain of her now, and whom she was equally certain of, and she thought that the love she felt for him was the most solid thing she had ever stood on. "Come inside," she said. He took her hand and they went in. The early months of the marriage were the practical, ordinary, deeply satisfying kind that do not make for dramatic stories but make for good lives. Susanna continued her work at the general store for the time being, because Ruth Alderman's eyes were not improving, and because the work was real and needed doing, and because Susanna had never been the sort of woman who stopped being useful when circumstances changed. She reorganized the sewing room at the house to her own preferences, which Ira observed with an interest that was both genuine and affectionate, and she put in a vegetable garden along the south side of the house, with the help of a woman named Dolores Garza, who was Pete's wife, and who came up from San Antonio with Pete in the spring, and had opinions about gardens that were worth listening to. Ira worked the land with the steady, methodical commitment that she had known from the start would characterize everything he did. He brought in a small herd from a ranch 2 counties east and worked with Pete through the late fall on the fence lines, and she watched him come in at the end of the day with the particular quality of tiredness that comes from physical work done well, and she learned the rhythm of his work and matched her own to it, and the house became a home in the incremental, real way that homes do. Horace Biggs rode out to the property once in October to congratulate them on their marriage with the grace of a man who had lost a competition he had expected to win, and Ira invited him in for coffee with the straightforward civility of a man who bore no one a grudge he had not specifically earned, and they sat at the kitchen table while Susanna poured coffee and spoke about the land and the cattle market and the railroad's progress toward Dellwood, which was expected within 2 or 3 years. And Biggs left with the air of a man who had been handled so politely he could find no specific objection to it. "He is not a bad man," Ira said afterward. "No," Susanna agreed. "Just a predictable one." Chester Wald, the land speculator from Fort Worth, had made Ira an offer on the northern parcel that Ira had politely declined, which had apparently increased Chester's estimation of him considerably, because he had gone away and come back 2 months later with a higher offer, and a general desire to discuss partnership arrangements that Ira was interested in on his own terms. And by November they had reached an agreement about a specific northern parcel that provided a steady income and left Ira in control of the pieces of land he intended to work himself. The agreement brought in enough money to make genuine improvements to the property, and Ira handled it with the same lack of ostentation that characterized everything about him. He hired 2 additional men for the spring season, brothers named Daniel and Marcus Pruitt, who were serious and competent, and who were not given to excess, and he extended the barn and built a proper chicken house and laid plans for a larger kitchen addition that Susanna had mentioned once, and apparently he had been listening more carefully than she had realized. In the spring, she discovered she was expecting a child. She told him on a Thursday evening when he came in from the south pasture, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she had let go cold, which he noticed immediately because she was not the sort of woman who let tea go cold. He sat down across from her with the focused attention of a man who understood that something significant was happening. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "We are going to have a child." His face did the sequence of things that faces do in moments of genuine surprise and genuine joy, starting from stillness and moving through a kind of wondering, and he reached across the table and took her hands in his, and held them with that characteristic gentleness that she had come to know as one of the specific things she loved about him. "Susanna," he said. "In September, I think," she said. He raised her hands and pressed his forehead to the backs of them, and she felt him breathe, a long exhale of something very close to wonder, and she smiled at the top of his head with a fullness of feeling that she did not try to contain. "Are you pleased?" she asked, though she could tell. He looked up at her. "I have never been more pleased about anything in my life," he said. "Good," she said, "because I believe this is going to require a great deal of work." "Most things worth having do," he said. "I knew you were going to say that," she said. "Because it is true," he said, and brought her hands to his lips again, and she laughed, and outside the kitchen window the Texas sky was going its evening colors, orange and rose and a deep, true blue that pressed down on the land like a blessing. Clara Briggs, who had by this time had her own son, a sturdy and opinionated child named William who looked exactly like Tom, was ecstatic about the news. She appeared at the house the morning after Susanna told her, with a basket of things she considered essential for expectant mothers and an energy level that required no coffee. And she sat at the kitchen table and talked about pregnancy and childbirth with the comprehensive frankness of someone who had recently survived both and considered herself an authority. Susanna listened and was grateful for it, because a woman going through her first pregnancy in a small Texas town in 1879 was fortunate to have a knowledgeable friend, and Clara, for all her vivacity, was genuinely useful in practical matters when it counted. Ira was attentive in the way that was specific to him, which was to say not fussy or hovering but consistently present and reliably thoughtful. He made sure there was always wood for the kitchen stove without being asked. He came in from work earlier in the evenings. He listened when she talked about how she was feeling without offering solutions when none were available, which was a quality she valued very specifically in him, the willingness to simply be present without trying to fix what was not fixable. There were moments, in those summer months of 1879, when she would look up from whatever she was doing, mending or gardening or simply sitting on the porch with her embroidery in the long evening light, and find him watching her with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that it caught at her heart every time. He had not been a man accustomed to happiness, she had come to understand. He had been a man accustomed to competence and work and self-sufficiency, and those were good things, but happiness was different, and he received it with the particular gratitude of someone who had not expected it. She loved him for that. She loved him for the specific way he said her name when they were alone, the slight change in the quality of his voice that only existed when he was speaking directly to her. She loved the way he was with Pete Garza, the easy respect between them, the friendship that had no need of display. She loved the way he thought through problems, out loud sometimes, working through the logic of things with a patience and thoroughness that she found admirable. She loved the way he was honest, genuinely and consistently honest, in the way that she had decided, somewhere between Dallas and Dellwood, that honesty was the quality she would prioritize above all others in any person she chose to love. Their son was born in September, a hot Saturday morning when the summer was finally beginning to release its grip on the land, a loud and emphatic boy who arrived with the conviction that the world owed him immediate attention, and whose first sound was so vigorous that Mrs. Carver, who was serving as midwife, laughed with surprise. Ira had been kept on the other side of the bedroom door per the custom of the time, in the company of Pete Garza, who had come to the house early that morning with dolers, and when he heard the child's first cry, he made a sound that Pete would later describe as the most completely human sound he had ever heard from a man who generally kept himself quiet. Susanna lay in the bed with the boy against her chest and felt the particular, extraordinary exhaustion of childbirth, and looked at this small, red, vociferous person, and felt something move through her that had no previous category. Ira came in and sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that was entirely private and entirely full. "He has opinions," Susanna said. "He comes by that honestly," Ira said, and she knew he meant from her, and it was not a criticism. They named him Joseph William Crawford, Joseph for Ira's father, William for Tom Briggs, who was his godfather, and the naming felt like the right kind of continuity, honoring what had come before while beginning something new. Joseph William Crawford was, from the very beginning, a person of considerable character. He was not an easy infant in the specific sense that he was not quiet or passive or inclined to sleep when sleeping would have been convenient for anyone. He was, however, enormously alert and interested in the world from an early age, watching everything with those amber eyes he had gotten from his father, and he was physically robust in a way that would eventually require Susanna to become significantly faster than she had previously been. The house that had been 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen was now 3 rooms and a proper kitchen addition, and a covered porch that ran the full length of the south side, and it was a real home, furnished simply and comfortably, with the quilt Susanna had made their first winter hanging on the wall of the parlor, because she liked it better as something to look at than something to cover up. The garden had expanded under Dolores Garza's influence and Susanna's own persistent effort, and there were now sunflowers along the front fence, because she had always liked the ones she had seen from her window at Mrs. Pettifer's boarding house, and it had seemed right to bring them here. Ruth Alderman's sight continued to decline, and in 1880 she made the decision to retire and move to Galveston to live with her daughter, and she asked Susanna to purchase the store and its stock and continue it. It was a significant thing to be asked, and Susanna thought about it for 2 days and then went to Ira and told him she wanted to do it. "Then do it," he said. He was sitting at the kitchen table going over the accounts for the cattle operation, and he looked up from the ledger with the direct regard that characterized him. "You are capable of running it better than anyone in this county, and it is what you want. Those are reasons enough." "It is a substantial investment," she said. "I know what it is," he said, "and I know what we have. It is a sound decision, and I believe in your ability to make it work. The question is whether you want to do it." "Yes," she said, "I do. Then we will make it work," he said. She bought the store from Ruth Alderman with the practical satisfaction of someone who had always known what she was capable of, and had been waiting for the circumstance to prove it. She hired a young woman named Annie Locke to help with the sewing and mending side of the business, a quiet and skillful girl of 19 who reminded Susanna of herself at that age, and she reorganized the store's stock with the comprehensive authority of a woman who knew exactly how a supply operation ought to be run. Within 6 months, the store's business had increased by a margin that even the most skeptical members of the Dellwood community could not deny. Ira never said "I told you so," which she appreciated, though his expression on the day she told him the latest month's accounts was the expression of a man who was thinking it and finding it deeply satisfying. "You could say it," she said. "I do not need to," he said. She loved him for that too. The railroad reached Dellwood in 1882, and the arrival of the railroad changed the town in the ways that railroads change small Texas towns, which is to say quickly and completely. New businesses arrived, new families, new money and new ideas, and a new kind of energy that was both exciting and somewhat alarming to people who had known Dellwood in its quieter configuration. The population roughly doubled in the first year, and the main street acquired several new establishments: a second hotel, a hardware store that offered equipment Susanna had previously had to order from Abilene, and a telegraph office that felt like an impossible luxury, the ability to send words across distances in minutes. Susanna expanded the store inventory to meet the needs of the growing town, and the sewing and seamstress side of the business grew substantially, with the arrival of new families who needed everything. She brought in Annie Locke as a full partner in the seamstress operation, because Annie had developed into an excellent businesswoman and deserved the recognition of the partnership, and Annie received it with a quiet happiness that made Susanna remember who had given her her own first real chance and be grateful. Dellwood's growth brought changes that were not all positive. More people meant more complex dynamics, more interests competing for the same land and resources, and there were injustices in that growth that Susanna did not look away from, and that era addressed where he could with the direct, practical manner of a man who was not interested in politics, but was interested in what was fair. There was a Mexican family named Vidal who had farmed a small parcel south of town for 15 years, and when the railroad brought speculators who decided they wanted that particular piece of ground, the Vidals found themselves facing pressures that were not entirely legal and were entirely unjust. Ira spent 3 afternoons with his lawyer on the Vidals' behalf, making certain that the paperwork on their claim was properly filed and registered and legally unassailable, and he funded the legal costs quietly without making anything of it. The Vidals kept their land, and Felipe Vidal came to the house to thank him, and Ira said it was the right thing, and that was the end of it. Susanna watched all of this and added it to her understanding of her husband, which was constantly being refined by the specific evidence of who he was in practice, which was always better than the theory. The railroad also brought opportunities. The livestock market became substantially more accessible, and Ira expanded the cattle operation with a deliberateness that was strategic rather than speculative, adding to the herd in careful increments, and improving the grazing management on the leased parcels in ways that increased the productivity of the land without depleting it. He was not a man who chased the maximum of anything. He was a man who built for the long term, and watching him do it was, Susanna thought, one of the specific pleasures of being married to him. In 1883, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Susanna Rhodes, who came into the world in a manner considerably calmer than her brother had, though she made up for her quiet arrival with a personality of extraordinary determination. Joseph, by this point 4 years old and possessed of enough energy to power the telegraph office, received his sister with a mixture of uncertainty and eventual, grudging enchantment, and within 2 months had appointed himself her primary guardian, a role he took with complete seriousness. Susanna watched her children and felt, regularly, a sense of wonder that was not diminished by repetition. She had not grown up with the expectation of family, not after 17 and the loss of her mother and then her father, and the fact of it, the simple, daily reality of these 2 people who were hers and Ira's, sitting at the kitchen table or running in the yard or sleeping in the room they shared on quiet nights when the Texas wind came through the curtains, moved her in ways that she could not entirely contain and did not particularly try to. She talked to Clara Briggs about it one afternoon, sitting on Clara's porch with the children playing in the yard below them, and Clara, who had 3 children herself by this point, said, "I know exactly what you mean," and they sat for a while in the companionable quiet of 2 women who had found their way to good lives by different routes and were mutually glad of it. Mrs. Pettifer retired from the boarding house in 1884 and moved to Austin, where she had a niece. She came to say goodbye to Susanna on a Tuesday morning with the reserved but genuine warmth of a woman who had watched a young person arrive with nothing and build something real, and she said that she was proud of her, which was more feeling than Susanna had ever heard from her, and which meant, because of that rarity, a great deal. Pete Garza and Dollars made their home permanently in Dellwood in 1884, Pete having decided that the commute from San Antonio was no longer worth the complications it involved, and that Dellwood suited them both. They built a small house on the western edge of the Crawford land at a price that era set well below what he could have asked, and Pete worked the cattle operation year-round thereafter, and the two families became the sort of close, daily neighbors who share meals and emergencies, and the ordinary texture of lives lived in proximity, which is the best kind of neighborliness there is. The years settled into a rhythm that was not static but was deeply rooted, the kind of life that changes constantly in its particulars while remaining consistent in its foundations. The children grew and became more themselves with each season. Joseph at 6 was reading with a ferocity that surprised his teacher, and an interest in the cattle operation that was entirely practical, following Ira around the property, with a clipboard made from 2 pieces of wood and a leather strap, making notes in the large, careful letters of a child who takes writing seriously. Alina at 3 was a creature of pure will and considerable beauty, with Susanna's gray eyes and Ira's brown hair, and a stubbornness that managed to be more endearing than infuriating in spite of itself. One evening in the autumn of 1884, Ira came in from checking the south pasture fence to find Susanna at the kitchen table doing the store accounts, the lamp burning low beside her and the children long since asleep, and he sat down across from her and watched her work for a moment without speaking. She looked up after a moment and found him watching her with that expression. The one she had learned over 6 years of marriage was the most private version of what he felt, uncalculated and unguarded. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. "About the bench outside the store," he said, "when I first talked to you. You had just gone down in the street and I helped you up, and I thought, sitting there, that you were the most interesting person I had met in a long time." She put her pen down. "Did you?" "Yes," he said, "and I was afraid of that, which is why I made the decisions I made, the ones you were justifiably irritated about." "I forgave you for those," she said. "I know," he said. "I am grateful for it. I think about it sometimes, that you could have gone. That I could have miscalculated and lost you before I found you properly, and I do not know what I would have done with that." She looked at him in the lamplight, this man of hers, weathered and certain and deeply, quietly dear to her. "You would have been all right," she said. "You were all right before." "I was functional," he said. "That is different." She got up from her chair and came around the table and sat beside him close, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into the solid warmth of him. The house was quiet around them, the particular quiet of a house where children sleep and outside the wind moves over the grass and the stars are enormous, and they sat in it together without needing to fill it. "Ira," she said. "Yes." "I am glad I came to Dellwood." He pressed his lips to her hair. "So am I," he said, "every day." They sat there a while longer, in the kitchen in the lamplight, and then she went back to her accounts, and he made them both a cup of coffee and sat across from her, and read the week-old newspaper that had come in on the stage, and neither of them said anything much more for the rest of the evening, because they did not need to, because this was the specific form that happiness had taken in their life, and they both knew it and were grateful for it. In the spring of 1885, there was a possibility that Susanna was expecting again, and she mentioned it to Ira on a Sunday morning before church, quietly, in the manner of something that was still taking shape and needed time before it became definite. He looked at her with those amber eyes that she had spent 7 years learning to read, and she saw in them exactly what she had seen the first time, the wonder and the gratitude and the happiness that he received carefully as something precious rather than something owed. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Well," she said. "Very well." "Good," he said. He took her hand across the breakfast table, the same careful way he had taken it on their first walk together, and she thought that of all the things she had come to know about Ira Crawford, this might be the one she loved most, the consistency of him, the way his care for her never became routine, never lost its quality of being chosen and deliberate, even after 7 years and 2 children and the daily business of a life built together. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am a very fortunate man," he said, "that I know it, and that knowing it is the most important thing." She squeezed his hand. "You are," she said, "and so am I fortunate." "I know," he said. "I made sure to find someone worthy of that conclusion." She laughed. "Ira Crawford," she said. "Was that a joke?" "A modest one," he said. "Goodness," she said. "You are evolving." He smiled at her with that slow, real smile that she had first seen in a crowded church hall in the spring of 1878, and that had never once failed to find something in her chest and make it feel lighter. The third child arrived in November, another boy, whom they named Thomas after Tom Briggs because it was right, and who arrived with the perfect timing and general cooperativeness of a child who had studied the situation in advance and decided to be reasonable about it. He had Susanna's gray eyes and a temperament that was balanced between his parents' characteristics in a way that seemed almost considered, steady like Ira and perceptive like Susanna. And from his earliest months, he had the quality of watching the world with an attention that suggested he was storing everything for later use. Clara Briggs held him at the christening and said he was the most serene infant she had ever encountered, which, coming from a woman with 4 children of her own, was both a compliment and a slight reproach to her own offspring, who were at that moment demonstrating their unserenity with enthusiasm in the third pew. Dellwood kept growing. The railroad brought it closer to the larger world in ways that were not always comfortable, and there were growing pains in the way that small communities have growing pains, the adjusting of old certainties, and the arrival of new complications, and the work of building something that could hold all the different people and interests that a growing town accumulates. Susanna was part of that work, through the store, which was now one of the primary commercial establishments on the main street, and through the quiet social authority that a woman earns in a community by being consistently reliable and honest over a long period of time. Ira was part of it through the land, which was a kind of authority too, the older kind, less visible but deeply felt, and through the way he handled conflict when it came to him, which was always directly and without drama, and with a consistent preference for fairness that people had learned to trust. Brother Carver retired from the church in 1886, and the new minister was a younger man named Hathaway who had grown up in the East and had ideas about how a Western congregation ought to be organized that took a little time to align with how a Western congregation actually functioned. Ira had a conversation with him after the third Sunday in which the new minister had made pointed reference to the proper organization of community affairs that seemed to include the implication that women ought to be less publicly prominent. And while the conversation was quiet and private, and Ira never reported what was said in it, Reverend Hathaway's next sermon was notably different in its emphases, and he never returned to the original theme. Susanna, who had not asked Ira to intervene and would have been capable of handling it herself, found that she was moved by the fact that he had done it anyway, not because he thought she could not manage, but because he thought she should not have to, and that the distinction between those two things was one of the reasons she loved him as specifically as she did. The children grew into themselves with the year-round evidence of 2 parents who were both fully alive, fully present, and fully honest, which is perhaps the most valuable inheritance any parent can provide. Joseph at 10 was already helping with the cattle records, with a competence that made Pete Garza nod with approval and Ira with pride that he expressed by asking his son's opinion on operational decisions and listening to the answers. Alina at 7 was already demonstrating that she intended to do exactly what she chose with her life, which her mother recognized, and which her father supported with the same uncomplicated conviction he brought to everything Susanna did. Thomas, at 2, was still primarily interested in being held and in horses, toward which he had developed an early and comprehensive passion. One afternoon in the fall of 1887, Susanna was closing the store for the day when Clara Briggs came in with her oldest child, William, who was 8 and very serious, and said that she needed to talk. They sat in the back room of the store in the way they had been sitting in back rooms of stores and on porches and at kitchen tables for almost 10 years, and Clara told her that Tom Briggs had been offered a position running the blacksmith operation in a larger town 3 counties east, a real opportunity that would mean a significant improvement in their circumstances, and that she was going to take it, and that she was sad and excited in equal measure, and that she needed Susanna to tell her it was the right thing. "It is the right thing," Susanna said. "You are sure?" "I am sure," Susanna said. "I'm as good at his work, and this will give him the chance to show it on a larger stage, and your children will have opportunities that Dellwood cannot offer. You will be excellent wherever you go. You always have been." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I am going to miss you terribly," she said. "I know," Susanna said. "I am going to miss you too." She reached across and took Clara's hand. "But we will write, and the railroad means we are not as far as we would have been 10 years ago." "It does," Clara said. She pressed Susanna's hand. "You know, you saved my sanity when you came here. I was starved for someone to talk to who had real thoughts about real things." "You would have found your way," Susanna said. "Eventually," Clara said. "You made it sooner." She looked at their joined hands. "You are the best friend I have ever had, Susanna Crawford." "And you are mine," Susanna said. They stayed a while longer in the back room of the store, talking about what they would always talk about, their children and their husbands and the work they had each built, and the small details of the life that was all around them. And it was Susanna who finally said that it was time to get home to dinner, and they walked out into the autumn evening together and went their separate ways. The Briggs family left Dellwood in October, and Susanna stood with Ira and the children at the end of the main street watching the wagon go, Tom's big shoulders solid at the front and Clara's arm waving back until the dust swallowed them. And she felt the particular sadness of losing the daily presence of a person you love, which is different from losing them entirely, but is still a real loss. Ira stood beside her and said nothing, but he put his arm around her and she leaned into him the way she always did, and after a moment she squared her shoulders and turned back toward the town. She wrote to Clara faithfully, twice a month, and Clara wrote back with the same frequency, and with all the news of her new life that Susanna had expected to be interesting and was. The letters were a thread between them that held over years and distance, as the best friendships do. The years that followed were the good years, the ones that would later constitute the substance of what the children remembered as their growing up, the particular golden quality of a childhood spent on good land with parents who knew each other completely. Joseph grew into a young man who was serious about the land and about books in equal measure, and when he turned 17, Ira made him a genuine partner in the operation, and the son accepted it with the gravity that was appropriate, because he understood what he was being given and how much it meant. Eleanor at 14 was already helping in the store with a confidence that made Annie Locke say she was the best natural merchant she had seen, and she had a way with people, warm and direct at once, that was entirely her own, and that made Susanna both proud and somewhat emotional in the way that a parent is sometimes overcome by the evidence that a child has become someone. Thomas at 9 had confirmed his passion for horses into something approaching a genuine gift, and Pete Garza, who knew horseflesh better than almost anyone in the county, said that the boy had a feel for it that could not be taught and should be respected, and Ira agreed and let Thomas spend as much time as he chose in the barn, which was considerable. One evening in the spring of 1890, Susanna sat on the porch in the warm dusk and watched Ira come up from the barn in the long slanting light, the same walk she had been watching for 12 years, unhurried and certain. And he came up the steps and sat beside her in the other chair, and they looked out at the land together as they often did, the grass going gold in the evening, the creek catching the last of the light, the cottonwoods big and full with their summer leaves. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the bench outside the store," she said. He looked at her. "You said you thought I was the most interesting person you had met in a long time," she said, "when you were sitting with me on that bench." "I did," he said. "I was thinking the same thing about you," she said. "I did not say it then, I thought it." He smiled, and it was the same smile, still slow and still real, the one that had not changed in 12 years. "We were well matched," he said. "We are," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the same careful, deliberate way he always had, and she held it, and they sat in the evening on the porch of their home, surrounded by the land they had made into something together. And the children were inside, and the horses were in the barn, and the creek ran in the dark toward wherever creeks go, and the stars were beginning in the east, and it was the particular completeness of a life that has been built honestly, with two people who are genuinely right for each other, and who know it, and who never stop choosing it. In the summer of 1891, Joseph Crawford at 18 fell in love with the blacksmith's daughter, a girl named Margaret Holt who had come to Dellwood the previous year with her family, and she was sensible and kind and had a good laugh, and Susanna watched her son be in love with the affectionate recognition of a woman who knew exactly what that looked like and what it meant, and she said to Ira one evening, "Joseph looks at her the way you look at me," and Ira said, "Then I approve." And that was all there was to it. Alina at 15 had made known her intention to eventually take over the store entirely, which surprised no one who had watched her in it, and she was already speaking of expanding into fabric imports from the larger city markets that the railroad made accessible, and her plans were serious enough, and her grasp of the business thorough enough that Susanna treated them with the respect they deserved. Thomas at 12 had begun training one of the horses himself under Pete Garza's supervision, and the horse was one of the new stock, a young roan mare with a difficult temperament, and Thomas handled her with a patience and confidence that Pete said was something to see, and that made Ira stand at the corral fence for a long time one Saturday afternoon watching his youngest son work, and come back to the house with that quiet, full expression that meant he had seen something that moved him. The town of Dellwood had grown into a place of real substance, with its 2 hotels and 3 churches, and the railroad depot that hummed with commerce, and the school that had expanded to 3 rooms and a full-time teacher and a part-time one, and the main street that was no longer packed dirt but planked and well-maintained. Susanna's store was one of the anchors of that main street, and she ran it with the comprehensive competence of a woman who had been doing this work for more than a decade, and who had made of a one-room general store something considerably more substantial. The Crawford property east of the creek was known throughout the county as one of the well-managed operations in the region, not the largest and not the flashiest but consistent and sound, the kind of ranch that makes good neighbors because it is run by people who understand that the long view matters more than the short one. On the evening of Susanna and Ira's 13th wedding anniversary, in the September of 1891, Ira put the children at the table and cooked dinner himself, which was not his strongest skill and which he accomplished with considerable concentration and some assistance from Alina, who had learned to cook with the same systematic approach she brought to the store. The meal was simple and good enough, and they sat around the table together, the 5 of them, and there was a quality to the evening that Susanna would remember for the rest of her life. After the children had gone to bed, she and Ira sat on the porch again in the fall night, and he poured them each a small glass of the whiskey he kept for occasions, and they touched their glasses together. 13 years, he said, and every year better than the last, she said. Is that true, he said. Yes, she said. Because every year I know you better, and you are a man who improves on knowing. He was quiet for a moment. You are the best decision I ever made, he said. In spite of the poor beginning I made of it. The beginning was not so poor, she said. It was just a little crooked, Crooked beginnings can lead to very straight endings. We are not at the ending, he said. No, she agreed. Thank goodness. He reached over and touched her face, a gentle, specific gesture that he had made 1,000 times and that still felt to her like the first time, and she leaned into his palm and closed her eyes for a moment. There was a night bird somewhere out in the dark, calling across the flat Texas landscape, and the grass moved in the light wind, and the stars were the same stars that had been overhead that first night they had stood outside the church hall and talked, and everything was different and nothing essential had changed. Ira, she said. Yes. I would do it all exactly the same, she said. Even the crooked parts, even the bench and the scattered laundry and being irritated with you for a week. All of it. So would I, he said, especially the bench. She laughed softly, and then she turned and looked at him. This man she had married and who had married her, and with whom she had built something lasting, and she thought that love, the real kind, the kind that holds through seasons and difficulties and the ordinary accumulative weight of years, is not a feeling so much as a practice. It is the thing you choose every morning when you wake up beside someone and choose again every evening and all the times in between, and the choosing gets easier with time, not because it matters less but because it becomes more natural than not choosing, becomes part of the bedrock of who you are. She had chosen him. He had chosen her. And they had made together something that would outlast them both, in the land and the children and the life they had built in this red-dust Texas town at the edge of the known world, and it was more than enough. It was everything. The last thing she said to him that evening, before they went inside and the night closed over the porch and the land and the silver creek in the dark, was this: "Thank you for catching me when I fell." He understood that she meant more than the day on the main street, more than the riderless horse and the scattered laundry and the ankle that had pretended to be fine. She meant all of it. "Thank you for staying," he said. And she had. She had and she would, and that was the truest thing there was.